So welcome everybody. My name is Carla Grand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute and the School of Theology and Seminary, I welcome you and have the privilege of introducing our speaker this afternoon, Shelly Matthews. As we continue to journey through this Lenten season and we edge towards Easter, it seems an appropriate time to think more deeply about the notion of resurrection. And this afternoon, Shelly will help us do just that as she points us specifically to the Gospel of Luke and helps us map out early resurrection meaning. A few words about Shelly. Shelly received her BA from the University of North Dakota, her MDiv from Boston University School of Theology, and her Doctor of Theology in New Testament and Christian Origins from Harvard Divinity School. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and served as a parish pastor for Rural Shared Ministry in North Dakota from 1987 to 1990. Shelly is currently professor of New Testament at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Prior to her work at Bright, she taught at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, and the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. This is Shelly's second residency at the Collegeville Institute, having been with us for the first time during the 2004 and 2005 academic year. She is here with her husband, George. Where's George in the back? And they will be with us through the end of this semester. So please join me in welcoming Shelly Matthews.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you all for coming. I am fully aware that the academic life being what it is, there are many places you could have been at this moment, and so I appreciate your taking time to come. And yes, I'm thankful that you will not be stamping out. I hope I give no one else to stamp out. And I might work from here just because I think this is the best way to do the PowerPoint, but I can see everyone. So let's go. So the paper I'm presenting today constitutes part of a larger research project I'm working on, which evaluates early Christian claims about bodily resurrection with respect to questions of justice, and especially with respect to questions of justice for the suffering righteous. This larger project is inspired by the writings and the life of the late Jane Shaberg, who in her monograph on the resurrection of Mary Magdalene, while reflecting on something Jacques Derrida described as outside the evangelical, doctrinal, or dogmatic space of the resurrection, before it, more originary than it, put forth an argument for resurrection faith as concerned with justice for the whole person, for the body, for the corporate human one, justice and perhaps mercy. I'm also in conversation with the scholarship of John Dominic Crossan, who in his presidential address to the Society of Biblical Literature in 2012 juxtaposed Eastern and Western Christian understandings of the resurrection and divine justice in the following way. Crossan characterized Western understandings of resurrection as focusizing and emphasizing future judgment and condemnation to hell of all people, aside from an exclusive group of right-thinking Christians. We can talk about that if we disagree, but I put up this slide for Margarita then. This is from the baptistry at Florence, and we could say Florence then is the heart of all of our problems, but we won't. It's just a place where this image comes. But again, in Crossan's mapping out of these resurrection trajectories, he argued that in Eastern resurrection images, we have more populist, what you could call more populist understandings, centered on Christ raising up and leading out. And I have as an example of that this fresco from the Kora Church in Istanbul, and it's an Anastasis, and Christ, of course, is pulling out Adam and Eve, right? And if Adam and Eve, then everyone, right? It's the resurrection in that way. We'll talk more about that before we end. But my work is also in conversation with the scholarship of John Gager, who argued in an article long ago that while Western Christian teaching about the resurrection in the 2nd century and beyond comes to conform with the hegemonic social order as Christianity becomes more at home in the world, he still notes that the proclamation of bodily resurrection may be seen as a permanent symbolic indicator of Christianity's ultimate refusal to identify itself completely with the secular order. And here I'm quoting, "The survival of belief in resurrection has meant the persistence of a latent symbol of protest, alienation, and transformation." I love my project. It is engaging. It takes me through a mountain of sources, both primary and secondary, about which I could speak for hours. But you are blessed this afternoon that I'm only going to focus on one verse, really, and only one phrase within that verse. That's how we biblical scholars work, right? The very small details. 3 words. The stunning, I would say, I call it the stunningly odd passage from the final chapter of Luke, in which the resurrected Jesus invites the disciples to touch and see that it is I myself, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. I would like to remind how startling that claim of I am flesh and bones truly is, in relation to other ideas of resurrection and translation that were circulating in the time that the Gospel of Luke was written. I also want to argue that this phrase evokes the image of the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37. And after making those 2 moves, I would like to puzzle through with you, in the question period ideally, whether or not Luke employs Ezekiel's vision in the service of justice for the suffering righteous or for some other purpose. So I start just reviewing ways that people have talked about, ways that biblical scholars have talked about the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. Traditionally, I would say they have looked to biblical narratives from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, to explain or to set context for how the resurrection narratives would have been heard. And surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, they don't look to the Ezekiel passage commonly or to other allusions to a resurrection in the Hebrew Bible, but rather to the ascent stories. It's Elijah and Moses sometimes is commissioning, and the Danielic Son of Man are often the intertext cited as inspiring or providing context for the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. I'm not going to go through all of this in great detail, but just a swish through some of the scholarship. Dale Allison and W.D. Davies have argued that the resurrection narrative that ends the Gospel of Matthew seems to evoke the Danielic image of the Son of Man. You have, for instance, common vocabulary. You have the heavenly triad in Daniel, that's Ancient of Days, the one like the Son of Man, and the angels in Matthew. You have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have the transfer of power from a divine power to a quasi-human figure. You have the worshiper serves as the central figure. So that's how they run through it according to the Danielic Son of Man. And then also like Moses, I won't take the time to go through that. This one I'll take a little more time on because I think it's kind of intriguing. Jane Shaberg argues, reading the story of Mary Magdalene's encounter with Jesus in the garden scene in John 20, that there are a lot of echoes, intertextual echoes to the story of Elisha and Elijah. She proposes that Mary Magdalene is to Jesus, or there are traditions underneath John 20 in which Mary Magdalene is to Jesus as Elisha is to Elijah. This strange term of endearment, not rabbi, but Rabboni, you know, my little rabbi, Shaberg suggests. She suggests it's not unlike the my Lord evocation of 2 Kings. Mary is pupil, fellow prophet, companion, follower of Jesus. Elisha is pupil, fellow prophet, companion, follower of Elijah. Jesus says famously, do not hold or cling to me, right? Elijah says 3 times, stay here. Jesus speaks of my father and your father, designates disciples as brothers, and Elisha cries out, right? So she's got more, but that's just to evoke the sorts of intertextual allusions that are the focus of Jane Shaberg's work. Here I'm going to skip almost entirely, except to note that it is also common to say that the rapture preservation tradition that we have with Elijah and Enoch and then other extra-biblical figures also seems to be a possible conceptual background for these stories of Jesus' resurrection. So without denying the influence of these Jewish biblical precedents upon New Testament narrative altogether, Recent scholarship attuned to the Roman imperial context of the first centuries of the Common Era has persuasively posited an even more direct influence on the resurrection narratives in the Roman apotheosis tradition. This scholarship takes as a point of departure the accounts of the apotheosis of Romulus, the first king of Rome, according to legend. The tradition that Romulus ascended into the heavens after his death is widely circulated in ancient Roman literature, both by those who accept the story and by those who dismiss it as mere myth-making. A large and intriguing version of it is preserved by Plutarch in his Life of Romulus. The ... I've been pairing just to get the basic bare bones of the story. But he tells the story, or shares the story, that Romulus was holding an assembly of the people outside the city when suddenly strange and unaccountable disorders filled the air. The light of the sun failed, and the night came down upon them with awful peals of thunder and furious blasts of rain. When the storm had ceased, the multitude anxiously sought for their king. The nobles exhorted them all to honor and revere Romulus, since he had been caught up into the heaven and was to be a benevolent god for them instead of a king. Okay, it's long. At that point, Proculus enters the story. He's a Roman nobleman. He's going down the road, and he runs into Romulus, who's now like glowing in light because he's been transformed into this heavenly god. And he asks him, "What's going on? What's happened to you?" And Romulus replies, "It was a pleasure of the gods, O Proculus, from whom I came, that I should be with mankind only a short time, and that after founding a city destined to be the greatest on earth for empire and glory, I should dwell again in heaven. So farewell, and tell the Romans that if they practice self-restraint and add to it valor, they will reach the utmost heights of human power, and I will be your propitious deity, Quirinus." No propaganda there. Romulus's death and ascent becomes a prototype for subsequent narratives of the apotheoses of Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and then other emperors in the imperial succession. One of my favorites is Antonius Pius here, who gets to go up with his wife. I just read an article by Mary Beard who suggests that there might be some even parody or spoofing here going on, or slight, because, I mean, look at this guy. I mean, it's a little goofy, right? And it's large, naked angel, humongous. But anyway, but this sort of imagery of the Roman emperor's apotheosis into heaven is ubiquitous at this time. Wendy Cotter, in an article published in 2001, helpfully underscores three themes in Plutarch's narrative of the death of Romulus, which recur frequently in the Roman apotheosis tradition and which are relevant to the gospel narratives of Jesus' resurrection. First, in order for the Roman state to make a formal pronouncement that an apotheosis has occurred, a credible witness is required to verify the ascent of the deceased to the heavenly realm. Second, Romulus returns from the dead to give counsel to his successor Proculus, and thus the apotheosis serves the successors of the hero as a legitimation of their rule. Finally, Romulus offers assurance that in his divine form he will remain a constant presence with the Roman people. Right? So you can hear bells about the sorts of stories told about Jesus' ascension. In a recent study of gospel resurrection narratives with special focus on Mark, Richard Miller provides a considerably more expansive case for situating these narratives squarely within the category of the Roman apotheosis narratives. His argument, I didn't reproduce it here because he produces a 20-point table of common mimetic signals shared by the translation of counts of Romulus and Jesus, and since I'm not producing a 20-point table, I'll give you the image. This is maybe Titus, we don't know, but it's an image of an emperor ascending into the heavens. These common features include missing bodies, prodigies, commissioning stories, eyewitness testimonies, ascensions, encounters with the translated hero on the road, frightened subjects, acclamations of the hero as Son of God, and inspired messages pertaining to the translation, right? So you can see, and it's not, you know, the images, if you grab, right? The ascension of Jesus, the apotheosis of the emperor, the winged one, let me just say as an aside, right? They needed either a cloud or a bird That is, there's no Superman images of flying. In the ancient understanding of how you heaven, you have to have a means of transport. Okay, now I lost my place. Okay. So anyway, back to Miller. In addition to providing a thick and compelling list of parallels between Roman translation fables and gospel resurrection narratives, Miller also makes explicit what scholars looking for Jewish parallels have implied when they turn to Elijah or the Danielic Son of Man rather than to something like Ezekiel as an explanatory background for the Jesus narratives. Miller notes that early Jewish resurrection ideas, while helpful in illuminating some forms of early Christian resurrection proclamation, contribute little to no aid in understanding these gospel stories of empty tomb and resurrection ascension in the canonical gospels. I quote Miller, "Resurrection in early Jewish literature never functioned to distinguish or exalt the individual as a standalone event. Resurrection stood instead as a general collective eschatological moment at the end of the age, an anticipated feature of the final judgment of humankind." Paul has some of that, right? Christ is the first fruits, but we've got this resurrection coming. But one finds no conventional trait of early Jewish eschatological resurrection, whether literary or conceptual, in Mark's concluding episode or in the subsequent Gospels, except for some exceptions I'm going to get to. In any case, I agree with Cotter and Miller that the Roman apotheosis tradition is fundamental for clarifying the canonical narratives of the empty tomb and the resurrection as a standalone event. The narratives that focus on the divinized Jesus alone rather than on corporate eschatological resurrection are mimicking imperial claims to cosmic lordship. Yet, as is now well recognized, mimicry in imperial context does not produce perfectly identical copies, right? Almost, not quite. Luke's particular version of the apotheosis narrative, which is the primary focus of this study, reaches into Septuagintal, that is Hebrew Bible, as well as Roman sources. It is woven of threads that do not perfectly cohere. Some stand in tension with his overarching attempt to assert supreme authority for Jesus as divinized body. I turn now to one aspect of the Lucan narrative which stands in tension both with this Roman tradition of apotheosis and with those Jewish narratives of ascent, the Elijah rapture tradition that I discussed. And that takes us back to this flesh and bones of Luke. In the final chapter of Luke, the flesh and bone of Jesus' earthly body are said to be still present in his resurrected body. In the post-resurrection appearance, he appears and says these words, right? "See my hands, feet, it's I myself, touch me, for spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see me having." Subsequently, he eats a piece of grilled fish, and that's to prove the point, right? He's a body, he eats. Among the canonical Gospels, this is the only narrative of an appearance of the resurrected Jesus which is explicit about the substances of which the body is composed. To review, as we get closer to the Easter season, right? Maybe you can do this mentally. In the Gospel of Matthew, the women grab onto the feet of the resurrected Jesus. So you've got feet there, presumably you've got palpability, but otherwise the narrative draws no attention to the body's substance. In the late appendix of Mark, it is reported that Jesus appeared in another form, but to those on the Emmaus road, but offers no specifics. As for the fourth gospel, and here we have the closest, seems to be a literary relation, both ancient authors and modern scholars have read Thomas's conditional proposition, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails and place my finger in the mark, I will not believe," as an apologetic for fleshly resurrection, and it works that way, right? But still, the climax of the Thomas scene in John lies in the realm of identity rather than physicality. That is, Thomas is able to confess the resurrected Jesus as Lord because he sees. His thing is, I have seen the Lord. You never know. It doesn't say he's invited to touch. But he says, I have seen. And the high point of the recognition scene is not Jesus' affirmation, well, blessed are you because you've seen a flesh and body, right? No, it's blessed are those who believe and have not seen, right? So we're in the realm of identity, not physicality. And also thinking about the fish scene in the Johannine appendix, as with Luke 24, Jesus takes grilled fish, but he distributes it. He doesn't eat it. So he distributes it along with the bread. So he's providing nourishment, right? He's not proving that he has a fleshly body. So that is thinking about this verse in relation to the Gospels. And then I would note that there is no clarifying parallel for this emphasis on flesh and bones in the apotheosis traditions associated with the Roman emperors. Richard Miller's extensive compilation of sources for his 20-point table of common mimetic signals pertaining to Jesus and Romulus includes a number of citations from Luke, the missing bodies, the ascension, the meeting on the road, the eyewitness testimony, yet there's no match for Luke's emphasis on the continuity of physical substances. Greek and Roman texts that do mention the hero's form after death can be categorized under two models. In one, the body is discarded, shed as an earthly encumbrance by a soul that ascends to the heavens and assumes an astral form. In another, it is translated such that the divinized hero is understood to still be anthropomorphically embodied and recognizable, but possessed of a higher form, one more suited for the heavens. Ovid, we've got an instance of a version of what happens to Julius Caesar, who in legend becomes a comet. But in his telling, Mars speaks that you've got to go get Caesar's body. Scarce had Mars spoken when Venus, who was the mother of Julius Caesar, took her place with the Senate House, unseen of all, caught up the passing soul of her Caesar from his body, and not suffering it to vanish into air, she bore it towards the stars of heaven. As she bore it, she felt it glow and burn, and released it from her bosom. Higher than the moon, it mounted up, and leaving behind it a fiery train gleamed as a star. All right, so there's your shining version of what happens to the emperor in terms of the apotheosis. And then you have the other version in the description of Romulus's fate, according to Ovid. There, as Ilia's son, Romulus, was giving kingly judgment to his citizens, Mars caught him up from the earth. His mortal part dissolved into thin air as a leaden bullet hurled by a broad sling is wont to melt away in the mid-heavens. And now a fair form clothes him, worthier of the high couches of the gods, such a form as has Quirinus clad in his sacred robe, right? So you shed the mortal parts, you get this new body. That is how the Romans do it. In the Hellenistic Jewish sources, we've got some more options. The search for, wait. Did I miss a page? Boop, boop, boop. Okay. Well, scholars for many decades had framed questions of ancient views of life after death according to the binary of Greek immortality of the soul versus Jewish resurrection of the body. A wide consensus now exists that Jewish sources from this period map, in fact, quite closely with the Greco-Roman ones noted above. Early Jewish descent traditions are either silent about the body or assume a translation resulting in a rarefied substance suited for the heavenly sphere. Consider Philo's description of the ascent of Moses, and I do dedicate this one to my colleague Alice Chapman, who I hope has the same sort of fate, just the one she wants. Afterwards, the time came when Moses had to make his pilgrimage from earth to heaven and leave this mortal life for immortality, summoned there by the Father, who resolved his twofold nature of soul and body into a single unity, transforming his whole being into mind, pure as the sunlight. Yes. Right. Okay. And then, aside from discussions related to particular exalted figures, Jewish sources reflecting more generally on the body in the afterlife often make clear distinctions between the earthly body to be discarded and the new body to be acquired for the heavens. Right? The Apostle Paul is the obvious one, I'm sure that you know so well. 1 Corinthians 15, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, perishable body must put on the imperishable. Right? Some, in fact, think that Luke is actually refuting Paul by having I'm flesh and bones, flesh and blood can't inherit, and there's some sort of tension going on. Josephus has something seriously similar, noting that the Pharisees understood the souls of the righteous as transferring into another body. The search for early Jewish sources that are concerned to stress bodily continuity in life after death, such as we find in Luke 24, brings us to a much smaller number of texts. I won't list all of them, but as an instance, I like this one because it's so vivid, from 2 Maccabees, where the martyrs readily sacrifice their bodies in full confidence that they will receive them again in the resurrection. In this first instance, complete with tongue and hands, right? He quickly put out his tongue, courageously stretched forth his hands and said, I got these from heaven because of his laws. I disdain them, and from him I hope to get them back again, right? And further down in Maccabees 13, the death of Razis, with his, this is in the middle of his martyrdom, right? Extreme torture, with his blood now drained from him. He tore out his entrails and flung them at the crowd, calling upon the Lord to give them back to him again. But there you have, I think, the most concrete assertion that resurrection is getting the body back. Okay, and there are a few others. Second Baruch argues that the bodies of the dead are given back at the time of judgment without anything changing in their form, and the purpose of this continuity is explained as facilitating the recognition of the dead. And others I won't mention, but without dismissing these strands of resurrection thinking as part of the backdrop against which Luke 24:39 can be illuminated, I still suggest that Luke's claim that the resurrected Jesus bears a body of flesh and bone has an even more direct and specific parallel, and that is the Ezekiel vision, because the Ezekiel vision has a vocabulary. He's looking out, and it's the flesh and the bones come back together, right? The sinews and all. It seems to me it's part of the mix of things that are being thought of. Luke shares with Ezekiel 37 the idea that resurrection entails the reconstitution of bodily substances of bone and flesh. But now I turn to the question, for what purpose or how does Luke evoke Ezekielian resurrection? And to this part of the paper that I'm going to first consider the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of Matthew, which use Ezekiel, I would say, in a more apocalyptic way, and then turn to the Church Fathers. First, to this section, the discovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls of a series of manuscripts identified as 4Q pseudo-Ezekiel, including fragments which preserve an adaptation of the dry bones vision, has prompted attention to the question of the role of Ezekiel in apocalyptic thinking at the turn of the era. I offer here the translation from the critical edition of this pseudo-Ezekiel set of fragments. Ezekiel, again, this is Qumran, right? So towards the turn of the era, maybe the 50s of the Common Era is how they date these fragments. Ezekiel said, Lord, I saw many people from Israel who loved your name and followed in the ways of your heart. When will these things happen, and how will their righteousness be rewarded? The Lord responded, I will show the children of Israel, and they will know that I am God. And then here's Ezekiel, Son of man, prophesy over these bones and say to them, let bone be joined to bone and joint to joint. And it was so. Then he said to me, prophesy a second time, let arteries come upon them and let skin overlay them from above. And it was so. Then he said, prophesy again upon the four winds of heaven, and they will blow a breath into the dead. And it was so. A multitude of people came to life, and they blessed the Lord of hosts who made them live. And I said, Lord, when will these things happen? And the Lord said to me, until after days the tree shall bend and shall stand erect. Obscure but biblical allusion. These Qumran fragments, dating to the 50s before the Common Era, are striking in that they read the vision of the resurrection of dry bones not as an allegory for national restoration after exile, as the original vision is, right? Remember, Ezekiel's off in Babylon. It's an allegory of that. But rather as a vision of righteous individuals, recompense and rejoicing in an impending eschatological era. Furthermore, the prophet Ezekiel is depicted here as an agent of the resurrection, restoring the righteous to life through the act of prophesying. I don't want to confuse you by saying that this comes from Qumran. It's actually a fresco from the Dura Europos synagogue in Syria. But the Ezekiel panels there are lovely, I have to say, and they do also evoke this image. Ezekiel's got his hand up to the Lord, right, gesturing down. The winged creatures of the four winds coming, called upon to restore the bodies to life. Here's another wonderful image from Dura Europos. And this is Ezekiel, actually. It's not four different people or three different people. It's Ezekiel in three different scenes. First being yanked up by the hair, Anyway, but those images, I would say, are not unlike what's going on in Qumran, those several centuries later. Among New Testament texts that employ the Ezekiel vision of 37 in a similar way, we might consider Matthew 27. The tombs were also opened, Matthew's on the left, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. That is said to happen immediately when Jesus dies, right? As I told my colleagues at the Institute, it's one of my favorite verses in Matthew, or images in Matthew, because then it goes on to say that they come to life at the death of Jesus, but they stay in the tomb for 3 days so that Jesus can be raised first before they are. But the vocabulary and the conceptual idea here parallels very closely Ezekiel 37:12. I'm going to open your tombs and bring you up from your tombs. The biblical scholar George Brooke tentatively suggests that in Matthew 27 we see the remains of an early Jewish Christian use of Jewish eschatological apocalyptic motifs about the resurrection to interpret the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then he notes that this interpretation did not survive widely in the early churches, which I think is right? How many of you in the Easter season are going to reflect on this image of the risen saints in Jerusalem at the death of Jesus? But Brooke's argument linking the resurrection scene in Matthew with Ezekiel I find compelling, though Matthew is not dependent upon the Qumran fragments. Both the canonical gospel and pseudo-Ezekiel imagine the resurrection of dry bones as a resurrection of the righteous from their tombs in an eschatological moment. For Ezekiel, that eschatological moment is imminent and pertains to a multitude of the righteous restored to life. For the Gospel of Matthew, the corporate resurrection pertains to the saints of Jerusalem and is said to occur at Jesus' death. In terms of the resurrection typology we have in these two texts, I suggest we are in the realm that has been captured in Eastern Christian iconography, right? Up and out. And everyone. I would say these are similar sorts of images. These instances of bones being covered with flesh and saints being raised up from their tombs employ Ezekiel's imagery to depict resurrection not as a punishing for evil, but rather as a leading out from evil. They focus on resurrection not in a faraway future, but in an imminent time, and in Matthew's case, in a time already present. They focus not on judgment and exclusion, but rather on restoring the righteous to life. Okay. We're getting closer. Now we go to the apologists, and you will be grateful that I realized that I couldn't do all of them in this lecture. We're just going to look at something from Justin, which can be called representative of what's going on in the apologists. In his first apology, Justin names the prophet Ezekiel. So these guys now start using Ezekiel, and includes a loose rendition of Ezekiel 37, verses 7 to 8, as proof that the prophets foretold the resurrection of the dead at Jesus' parousia. And I will read. For the prophets have foretold two of his arrivals, one which has already been, and the second when he will raise the bodies of all humans who have ever existed. The righteous he will clothe with immortality, while he will send the wicked, bearing eternal sensory perception with the evil demons into the eternal fire. For this has been spoken through the prophet Ezekiel. Joint will be placed next to joint, and bone to bone, and flesh will grow again. Justin is not speaking of bodily resurrection as part of an imminent apocalypse, but as part of a just judgment pushed into the future. While he allows that the righteous will be rewarded at the second coming, right? They get a sentence. It's like Dante's, the 3 volumes. We all like the Inferno, right? That's where you keep your attention. The comedy's boring, but so he gives the righteous their due, but his, the intensity or his passion is about what will happen to the wicked. And the wicked, it's important for them to have this fleshly resurrection, because for Justin, you have to have flesh in order to feel pain, in order to have the internal sensory perception. So you've got to have a fleshly resurrection, as Ezekiel predicted, so that the damned can feel the torment, right? That is his need to remind of the fleshly resurrection in Ezekiel. With Justin, what Justin, Irenaeus, and Tertullian share in common in the reading of Ezekiel, and again I've skipped Irenaeus and Tertullian, is insistence on literal fleshly but not imminent resurrection. For Justin especially, the privileging of flesh has to do less with speedy restoration of the righteous than the eternal torment of the wicked. The bodily substances of flesh and bones serve as a guarantor of continuity and make possible the infliction of pain. For all of them, the assertion of flesh and bones as guarantor of continuity aligns them with other well-known arguments for continuity they espouse. The continuity established between the God of Ezekiel and the God of Jesus, and thus the claims of Christians on both Old and New Testaments. The continuity which also assures that the solidifying leadership structures of the church in this world are the structures that will guide the church in the age to come. I was just going to say, right, so this, to sum up Justin's resurrection, it's mostly about this, right, back to that. So now we go to Acts, and again, I'm clipping, I'm sorry, thank you for your patience, we're almost done, but I want to think about Luke in context to what else Luke and Acts say about the resurrection, and then to think about, well, then what are they doing with the Ezekiel vision? First, and obviously, as we've already pointed out, the Lucan narrative imagines a literal resurrection of the body in flesh. Luke is thus the first Christian author to insist on the nature of resurrection as fleshly, a point which will come to be asserted with increasing force by a number of early Christian authors, right? Resurrection of the flesh, distinctly Christian. And in the case of Justin, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, a point for which Ezekiel's vision is offered as proof. Second, as with Justin, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, Luke employs in their employment of Ezekiel to proclaim a future rather than an imminent resurrection. So the resurrection of Jesus in flesh and bones in Luke does not signal imminent resurrection. Rather, it is said to inaugurate a time of preaching, of repentance and forgiveness in Luke 24, and that's further elaborated in this passage here in Acts 1. The disciples see the resurrected Jesus, so they come together and ask, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel? And the answer is no, not now. Later, don't ask. Third, as with the apologist, Luke's emphasis on continuity of resurrected substances correlates with an emphasis on the importance of the scriptures as authoritative witnesses to the resurrection that is flesh. Continuity of flesh is analogous to the emphasis on continuity of scriptures, and the apologists are all about that, and I would say Luke, of all the gospel writers, is also very emphatic in the sort of totalizing way that all of the scriptures lead to and point to this event. And then finally, and most densely, which I know is bad public speaking strategy, end with your densest piece of text, but in the speech of Peter, he rolls together all of this stuff: apostolic authority, fleshly resurrection, future judgment. In the speech before Cornelius, when he says God raised him on the third day, made him manifest not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God, who ate and drank with him. That's an indication of his fleshiness, because he eats and drinks. And he commanded us to preach. He's the one ordained by God to be judge of all the living and the dead. I am just going to conclude at this point. The resurrection narrative of Luke 24 conforms in many ways to the Roman apotheosis tradition. Yet, one strand of the narrative seems out of place with the concept of resurrection as bodily translation, namely the Lucan emphasis on Jesus' resurrection in flesh and bones. Unlike the Roman emperors or those identified with the Jewish ascent tradition, the body of the Lucan Jesus does not appear at resurrection to have been transformed into an ethereal substance or to have been dissolved of its mortal trappings. This may be explained by Luke's incorporation of a resurrection image familiar from the Ezekiel tradition, one that affirms the solid substances of the resurrected body. Yet, while Pseudo-Ezekiel and the Gospel of Matthew employ this vision to assert an imminent resurrection of the righteous, the raising up and leading out, Luke's insistence on resurrection of flesh and bone seems not to reflect a similar urgency, a similar protest against the current state of affairs. Rather, like the early apologists, he adopts Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones for a church that is carving out a place for itself in the world. Luke's resurrected Lord will not trouble the imperial system in any immediate and transparent way. And so I would say that Luke is doing a lot of this, right? I mean, and some of this, right? So that's how he's putting it together. But yet, I always end with an and yet. I do wonder whether first readers hearing the resurrected Jesus describe himself possessing flesh and bones might have reflected on this populist notion of the valley of dry bones that circulated at the time it was written. Might we have in Luke 24:39 at least a latent symbol of protest, alienation, and transformation in the form of a resurrection narrative? Thank you for your patience. That's it. So, we have some time for questions. At any level. Body, Alice, yes.
So without Luke, we wouldn't have as strong of an assertion of resurrection, avoiding the Roman sort of idea, right? So we really have that important Luke idea that's very different, that differentiates the Gospels. Then, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say
because it's the same. It isn't just a ethereal, or it isn't just translated or something different, right? So that, even more than Matthew or John or anybody else, it's the Luke passage that's the key tie to the bodily resurrection.
That's very interesting. I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean, I would say Luke cares the most about it. Again, John is used, and you can make it was read in the ancient. I mean, Irenaeus cites it as proof of the fleshly resurrection. But Luke is the first, I would say, to use flesh, and then the fathers, you know, is beginning in the mid-second, but then forward it is flesh, 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 and then what are they doing with it? Mostly what they're doing is, you know, making sure, I mean, not mostly, but certainly one of the, one of the things they're doing is this, as Justin quote, you've got to have flesh, otherwise those damn people won't feel, right? They'll get off the hook.
Yeah.
So that's.
I like that.
Yeah. But then there's, you like that? But I would also say of them, I do think, because you've got, what's that?
The one is being roasted in the corner.
Oh, yeah, with his head.
Ooh.
Never mind.
Okay, but anyway, yeah, I would say Luke is key for a lot of things. I don't know which slide you want to look at. I lost the PowerPoint itself. Certainly because you have Luke and Acts, I would say you've got the long view, you've got settling down for the long view, and I mean, a lot of my colleagues in New Testament scholarship now are talking about empire criticism of the Gospels or critiquing empire. I just think Luke and Acts have the least amount of that critique, that it's more this apology. It's okay, we won't bother you, you know, we're like you, sort of mimicking empirical things, I would say. So, I mean, there's a lot going on in that final chapter of Luke. Lots and lots.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Dorothy?
This is a really simple question. I mean, it could be an 8th grade confirmation question.
No.
I've never really linked resurrection and ascension in my own mind as closely as you do. And maybe that's a failure of my own imagination.
I would
But
say...
there are separate sentences in the
Thank you.
creed. There are separate sentences. And there is this period of time in between the two, which seems...
According to Luke, you've got the 40
Well,
days.
Yeah, and John, there's time, there's the resurrection, and then there's the... I see, because then you don't get ascension there.
Yeah,
Matthew?
John, right, is kind of immediate, and yeah, no, I take your question that resurrection and ascension certainly can be viewed as different steps. But actually, I would argue, and I'm convinced by Richard Miller, that the ending of Mark, the abrupt ending, that actually is an ascension. There is an announcement that Jesus is resurrected, but you don't have. Why don't you see him? You don't see him because he's up in heaven. That is, that early readers who knew the Romulus story, for example, or stories like that, of course you couldn't see a body. He's been resurrected, so their resurrection and ascension are you know, more identical. I would say in John, even, and I was just thinking of this listening to the lectionary on Sunday at the church in which we worship. John, crucifixion is already ascension. Right? There's no, when John speaks about cross, I will be lifted up, I will be lifted up.
That's the glorification.
What's that?
The cross is the glorification of John.
Yeah, so, and then, so in that sense, I think you're right, creedally and in other ways we have separated them, but in the narratives, and even in Paul, you know, he's raised, what happened? Oh, he raises and then he appears, right?
Yeah.
And ascends. But at least in the narratives in some early Christian stands, it's kind of a piece.
Okay.
It's and without his ascension, I mean, can you think of a Christian tradition where there is no ascension but just resurrection? Because that, of course, would be the Ezekiel vision, if you will, right? I mean, certainly in Paul, you have it all. You have the resurrection appearances and ascension. You don't have this non-ascension piece. But there it kind of has to be the ascension piece as the world goes on and there's no culmination, right? Paul, I would say, when he describes Jesus as the first fruits, and I always have to get this to my students, the first fruits come in the same season as the last fruits, right? First fruits, if you're in the Carolinas, are those peaches that come in June, but the rest of the fruits come by August. So in that image, he's expecting this general resurrection, but there is no general resurrection. And as in line with that, there's more emphasis on ascension, second coming later. Thank you. Any other body questions? There's so much fascinating stuff with the body. Yes.
You raised it a couple times today. You talked about it earlier with the group, and that is the relationship between resurrection and this protest against injustice and the injustice of early death or torture and so forth. What difference does it make to that issue of injustice in terms of terrestrial life, and whether you go with the Pauline understanding of resurrection or you go with the Lucan understanding of resurrection? Don't they both address the whole issue, or at least potentially address the issue of injustice? And if not, why?
Well, I would say that once you got into the apotheosis tradition, then what you're saying is Jesus is like the emperor, and then you're focusing on his, emperorness, and you certainly could lose the question of, well, what about everybody, right? So it moves into the it moves into the worship of the emperor rather than the longing for the corporateness, or at least it can. It certainly seems to me there are forms of Christianity where you see that. I mean,
so you're saying if you go that route, you buy into the whole apotheosis tradition, which emphasizes.
Well, if you emphasize the ascension of Jesus rather than the general resurrection, I would say, and I don't know if I'm looking forward to trying to persuade people or past assessing how Christianity has unrolled, but I do think that there are many forms of Christianity in which emphasis on the suffering righteousness is kind of lost. And I think I talked about that in our discussion. If you flick through the hymnals for resurrection hymns, in my tradition, you get a lot about Jesus forgiving sins, sin, judgment, his ascension, we all get to live forever, other things because our sins are forgiven, but not so much about the redemption of the suffering righteous. Jennifer, I think, rightly has advised me to look to Latin American expressions of resurrection faith. Certainly in the Oscar Romero tradition, you have more of a sense of that. So I'm not saying that you can't, but I guess I would say that this, where I went back to the beginning somehow. I was just looking for those slides of, the Emperor's ascension. I mean, you don't have to think about these people down here. I mean, if at least this slide, for instance, what are you thinking about, or what's the focus of it? And I guess these people are adoring Jesus. So the Christocentric focus can possibly or potentially detract you from the ecclesiology, I would say. Thank you. There was one more question? A couple more? Yes, Weldon. Are you missing your plane, by the way? You weren't supposed to be here.
No,
okay,
my flight got delayed, so
okay.
I got to hear you. I guess I still have, clearly, you shown so well things you've been talking about or heard you say over the last couple of months, in that Luke deals most clearly with the flesh and bones, and so. And the end, yet I still hold with that, is that there was something quite distinct or different from the resurrection Jesus that appeared with flesh and bones, that is not the same as the pre-crucifixion Jesus in the body. So it seems to me that it's still something going on that's inadequate or not or confusing or inappropriate to speak of bodily resurrection as the restoration of the pre-crucifixion.
Because I think we talked about this, because even in Luke he banishes that sort of thing.
Yes, right. There's a whole range of things that happen that it's clearly not recognized and then recognized and so on.
More so in John. I mean, the Luke is funny. What I would say is when you get to Acts, even more so than the flesh and bones thing, is I think it's just fascinatingly funny. The speeches about Jesus' resurrection insist that his body did not corrupt. His body was not corrupted. It's actually the opposite of Paul, who understands resurrection as a sort of transformation. But at least one strand in Luke wants to say his body is the same. And actually, I think that's part of this tradition. It's the same because we're in the world and nothing's going to change. That is this conservativizing thing. But you're right, there are other images going on too. Then, of course, like all text, right? You've got it's virtually impossible to get a text with a 100% consistent ideology, right? Other things are going on as well.
And it's quite possible that the non-recognition of Jesus on the road to Emmaus has to do with Emmaus as possibly, I mean, you're the scripture scholar.
Yeah,
but
and you're the liturgist, right? I know you guys like that one.
A liturgy, a liturgical thing, you know, in other words, you don't recognize him. The word is opened, his words are open to you. Then you have the Eucharist, and in the Eucharist, you recognize him, and as soon as you recognize him, he disappears.
Right. A lot of stuff going on in that Emmaus passage, and I would say, that's another reason I think that Luke itself, I think Acts is written in the 2nd century. I think at least the final chapter of Luke is written in the 2nd century, because it's got such a long view of the church, and certainly this liturgical, Emmaus is liturgical. And you kind of figured that out already in the 60s, I don't think, or the 80s. But also then, what was I going to say? Well, I would also argue that it fits with that thing that Peter says, is he didn't appear. Essentially, Peter says in Acts 10, he only appeared to the 12. That's essentially what he says. And part of the reason he can say he only appeared to us is he didn't appear to the people at Emmaus. They saw him through the break. They saw him the way ordinary and all Christians now will see Jesus, through the word and the bread. And that Jesus' appearance is the special thing that makes the apostles, which makes the apostolic succession, right? Which closes off Mary Magdalene and others Mary Magdalene might represent. Just saying. Anything else?
I have a somewhat, just sort of a curiosity. The pseudo-Ezekiel fragments from Qumran, what language are those in?
Hebrew, right?
That's what I thought. But the reason I ask is because that whole notion, one of the things that was sort of hitting me was that whole notion of the four winds coming and giving breath, and those are used later by Christians later on as images of the Spirit, right? The wind, the breath, right? Anathema. In the Septuagint rendering.
Yeah, but that's a Jew. I mean, there's breath
exactly.
in Judaism before Christians use it. But so it's still, it's in Ezekiel in the original story of Ezekiel 37. So that funny Qumran thing, because these are now the fragments. It's I think more recently published, 2000s, not those initial. Not part of those initial publications, but it's kind of fun to see this stuff now too, how Ezekiel was worked. And I do think it's like the Matthew thing, that this was an idea. There's one guy who argues that nobody really believed or imagined Ezekiel in a literal way. It's obviously an allegory in Ezekiel 37. that, you know, that people couldn't have come from that to bodily resurrection until Jesus came. And it's obviously a Christian apologetic argument about the uniqueness of Jesus' resurrection, but I mean, it's flesh and bones coming to life. It takes that much imagination for someone at Qumran, and actually it's probably, anyway, I won't get into the details of 4Q pseudo Ezekiel, which are very wonkish. Any other things? Nobody wants to ask about the body. Ask some more body things. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the practices, particularly in the first couple of centuries of the church, in terms of, you know, did they think that you needed to keep certain body parts intact in order for the resurrection to happen, and how that translated into practices?
That's a good question, and certainly some of you at the School of Theology, I mean, if you know your church fathers, it becomes a pressing question. I mean, the pieces I think about are actually Tertullian because of the eating of the right, the destroying of the bodies, and you know the what do you call it? I don't want to say Colosseum, but the, you know, thrown to the beast. Yeah, thrown to the beast sorts of things. But Tertullian has that famous thing where he says, yeah, the flesh of the humans does not disintegrate. You know, it gets given back so that you can rise whole, which is, you know, so I mean, you have that. That's one thing I think about. Early in the Pauline sphere. Yeah, I mean, Paul does have a more spiritual, you know, Paul does not, I think Paul is not in this tradition of affirmation of flesh. Paul says pretty clearly in Corinthians, flesh and blood do not inherit. And so he is imagining some sort of more, the spiritual body, which is different. And so, you know, they're baptizing the dead in Corinth, but, you know, does he have this more Ezekielian image of flesh? Probably not. I think he's got the more, you know, I guess you could call it Platonic, more understanding of bodies rising or somewhere else. Yes?
So do you think in the early church they would have thought of resurrection more in the Pauline sense of transformation, or in the sense of somehow a sort of apotheosis sort of a thing, or would they have thought of it in the fleshly way which exemplified in Luke and tied with Ezekiel?
Good questions. What you find in both the Christian sources and the Jewish sources is you don't have just one view, right? You've got all sorts of things. You've got the Thessalonians, Paul saying the dead will rise first, right? Which is actually, I've been pointing out, is one of my friends who's working on that. It's kind of like the up and out image because everyone's flying up, right? And if you get to fly up, then heaven is democratic, right? Because of course in the Roman apotheosis tradition, it's the emperor's family, right? And there are many images of Roman apotheosis that have a split view. You've got the heaven where the emperor is, and then the bottom where you've got the barbarians being crucified, you know, conquered and pacified. So you could argue that the flying, we will all fly up to meet him, or they will fly up, the dead first, is a sort of democratization of the heavens. You know, so you've got that vision, you've got Luke very fleshy, and then that is the sort of comes to be the orthodox position, is the flesh. But then of course, since the end doesn't come, then you have this sort of middle position that, well, your soul goes to heaven, but on the judgment day you'll get joined together. Because you've got, you know, there's a wonderful thing, I think it's the Apocalypse of Peter, where Peter is taking some dead guy's soul up to heaven, and he says, now look, take a look at your body, so you can find it. You know, on the day of the resurrection. It's kind of like a road check. Yeah, it's like a road check. But again, I would say there are lots of views, and part of my work, what I want to do is pull out some that are less well known or less meditated on, and you know, to displace some of the more, what I think, some of the more imperial ones, if you will. Right, the emperor up in the heavens.
And do you think this is the Lucan one gets enshrined in the creed? Do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, Luke is the Luke of the four Gospels, which are written before orthodoxy is invented, if you will. Can I do that here?
Yes,
Luke
you could say
is. I would say Luke is the forerunner of. I mean, Luke is. I would say he's 2nd century. He's so close to Justin. I can't even say. If you, I mean, in terms of how he's thinking and, you know, how he's representing sort of views and beliefs that I think become predominant at the expense of, again, things like the Mary Magdalene traditions, which if you look not just in the Gnostic sources, but even in John, I mean, Mary had to have been a player. She was a player, folks. I mean, there's just a lot, I mean, that even John 20, what is on? It's a, so she's a player, but you would not know, if I can say that colloquially. So Mary traditions go, more spirit traditions go, all of that Gnostic stuff goes. All the Jewish, more affirming of Jewishness, less polemic against Judaism goes, and so Acts gives us Peter in the way that we know, especially in the West. Okay, you've stayed for 60 minutes. Thank you. Is there?
Can I say one thing of the 4 or 5 that I wanted to say?
Okay.
Just one.
Yes. And yes, go ahead.
Just this. Besides the imperial apotheosis, would you also consider the apotheosis of Alexander the Great?
Right.
That would be the literary antecedent of that, and the Roman of Alexander would circulate a lot in that environment.
Thank you. Yeah, just for consolidation, I stuck to the Roman, but you do have Alexander, so you have these Greek, you have the Greek ones before the Roman ones.
And the fact that he had a very mysterious death that was a lot speculated upon, and it's almost like an anti-tomb, Alexander's death.
Yes, no, thank you. And again, I'm just for purpose of elimination, we all have this problem. I have been sticking just with the Romans ones, but I should look back at Alexander, because you're right. I mean, there is Proculus, or Romulus is not the first, right? You've got the Alexander tradition as well. So yeah, I don't have anything to say about it, except that you're right, I should look at it.
And with the bringing up the Alexander, it would be interesting if that had any effect, or what kind of effect it may have had on Philo's description of Moses.
Moses? Because Alexander, I don't know if that's the sort of, is that the understanding, that Moses thing is?
Yes, and they are actually later on connected, like the fact that Moses at some point has horns is connected to
the apotheosis of Alexander.
But I don't remember anymore how exactly.
Okay.
But the fact of having these horns and horns of light and stuff, it's
Okay, so
connected
that's,
to that.
yeah, no, I'll take
like,
some more looking,
Removed
thank you.
in my memory, so I don't know how, but it is.
Yeah,
Some of that
thank
is
you.
the translation of Cornu and Cornu.
Yes,
That's a translation
Yeah, it's
issue.
also a mistranslation, but
Yeah.
The horns of
they're
Moses,
kind of
yeah.
connected, so I don't know.
Yeah.
And the fact that, I mean, Alexander is depicted like being raised, like you say, that it takes something flying to take it. And
Yeah,
flying.
no, that's right.
exactly
Those
how it's
Supermen in
being
the ancient
depicted,
world,
yes.
you have to have a mode, a
Yes,
cloud or a bird.
vehicle of weird images, yes.
Yes. So
Yeah.
funny. One of the things I've been struck by at the Institute as I've been doing my work is that, many of the Roman apotheosis traditions are preserved by people who don't believe them, right? I mean, Plutarch is very clear. He tells the story of Romulus, but he's like, this is, ridiculous. And then this, that angel image taking up Antoninus Pius. I'm struck by this Mary Beard article who's saying, look, they're kind of making fun of it. I mean, so that there are these famous ones. Claudius is said before he dies to say, "Oh, I'm going to become a god." Right. Yeah. So in the Roman apotheosis tradition, there was a sort of irony, or it's
Well, Seneca's apotheosis of the pumpkin.
yes, the pumpkinification of
Yeah.
Claudius. Right. He comes up with a gimpy foot. So that is interesting to think about, because in the gospel tradition, you just have belief. I mean, the closest thing you have is, right, they didn't believe the women, they thought it was an idle tale. So there are certain recognitions that not everybody believes this, but in the Roman tradition, I think it's more mainstream to question, right? It's so that, I guess, different audience, who's writing the Gospels versus who's writing these other stories. But man, I'm sorry, I'm fascinated by it. Thank you for indulging me the time to talk about it, and it is an hour. Should we give people
Mark had one?
freedom?
just-
Take one last.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
That's right, I just wanted to revisit that point about your reading of the end of Mark as suggesting to readers this picture of the ascension and the resurrection being at one and the same time, and therefore being a kind of part of the emperor view of resurrection.
Yes.
Because I mean, that's so startling to me because otherwise Mark has such a low Christology. And I mean, John, for example, you have a pre-existent logos, so you wouldn't be surprised when you circle around at the end for that sort of thing to happen. But is it right that readers then would have instantly had that image with otherwise such a low Christology in Mark? I mean, such a fleshy
God,
Jesus.
the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. How does the Mark 1 go? I mean, you're right, it's lower in the sense that he's certainly, as he walks the earth, has got more human likeness to him. But how does Mark 1:1 go? What is it? The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Messiah?
Yeah.
That's pretty high.
Isaiah.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, then he quotes Isaiah. But I mean, in some ways, that first verse kind of has a trumpet call. And you're right, it's not Johannine. But again, Romulus wasn't necessarily divine, right? I mean, Romulus was a king, but then he's exalted. I guess the idea that, I mean, we as modern readers have been, not so much anymore because of sophisticated literary criticism, but certainly for a long time people thought that was a weird ending, right? It's not a real ending. And even in the early church, right, they wrote more. But the guy I am convinced by, I mean, actually, I thought it was the ending for other reasons as well, but he does make the point that in many of these traditions, if you've been translated, there is no body. And actually some guy working on this, for example, there's a cue saying of Jesus, "You will not see me again until I come."
Right.
I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but there are some sort of cue traditions of resurrection that really are about disappearance of the body. That is, the resurrection is whoop up into the heavens. And you might even see that in Paul, like in some of his Christ hymns, he took on the form of man, he took on the form of slave, but then went back up again. So,
again, the tradition again of kind of being transformed into constellations, for example.
yes,
So that is another antecedent of apotheosis, and that was circulating in a Hellenistic environment, also
Yeah, the
at a higher
stars.
level, like the Baronites.
the what?
Well, whatever. I can't,
Anyway,
I
we'll
can't translate that
we'll
into
talk
some
about it
sort.
later, but yeah.
But so there is
It's becoming the stars, right?
Yeah, so not having a body somehow.
Yeah, and I mean Daniel has that, right? Or as with the wisdom of Solomon, they'll shine like the stars, right? So, and Paul has that too. I would say it's more astral body. Okay, I'm just gonna say one little thing. If you ever get in Bible bodily resurrection trivia, you should know this one thing about the body, which is that before the Christian era, there was an understanding that you would go into heaven with your human, or that you would survive in the afterlife, whether that was heaven or Hades or whatever, with the bodily imperfections that you had, right? So that if you had a wound or if you lost your shoulder in battle, right, you still, so you don't put your body back. And Claudius having the gimpy foot is like that. So you get to go up, but you don't have your body restored. And then early Christians started thinking about healing, what happens through healing, and then you start to get the story of bodies coming back. But certainly in the Greek tradition, you bear your wounds when you're shaved. I'll just think about the body. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shelly.
Thank you.